Welcome, everybody. Today is Tuesday, March the 4th, and on Tuesdays we have Mr. Dwoskin. So Mr. Dwoskin will present his In the Headlines lecture series. Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Angela, and hi, good afternoon, everybody. What a week. What a week we've had. It's just been so remarkable. It's, one enormous event after another. And I think not only we here are shaking, but pretty well the whole world is holding their breath to see, what's going to happen next. It really is a most remarkable week. And, as we speak, we were just looking that the US and world stock markets have dropped tremendously. The whole kind of economic world is shaking on the front of the United States, Russia, Ukraine. The whole world is shaking. So President Trump in less than a month, we're talking now, no more than a month, but January 20th till today, he's managed to kind of upend practices and values and understandings that have been around for certainly since the end of World War II. So maybe what we ought to do is start with the tariffs issue. And for people who are looking at the next day, and for people who are interested in business, and for people who are going about their daily lives buying things, this might seem that this is the most important thing that Trump has done, to declare and raise tariffs on China, on Mexico, and on Canada, which will affect billions and billions of dollars of trade across these three countries, and which will have an effect on raising prices everywhere, and which will have an effect on perhaps diminishing the amount of choice that people have when they shop. And so people might say, my God, my whole life is going to be turned upside down if prices go up 10%. But according to the way I see things, this is by far and away far, far less important than Mr. Trump's other achievement, which was to blame Ukraine for starting the war with Russia, and for saying that basically that the United States has no interest in defending Ukraine. I think if you have to measure the two events, the declaration of tariffs and the about face on Ukraine, the about face on Ukraine is far, far, far more important in the long run, because tariffs are something that could be here today and gone tomorrow. Tariffs are an economic move which have economic fallout, and which countries adapt to, and consumers adapt to, and it's not really something of principle beyond economics. Whereas the abandonment of Ukraine says to the world that the United States' word is not worth anything, that the United States abandons its allies, and that no one can count on the United States anymore. So you could see the difference in the kind of, we'll call it philosophical terms, between taking an economic move and doing a move which affects allies and affects the whole world balance of power. Anyway, if you want to balance those two out, to my way of thinking, the abandonment of Ukraine is really the biggest news item of the most important one, actually. But let's look at the tariffs issue first of all. And there is an essential hypocrisy there, because the supposed reason for the declaration of the tariffs is because Mexico and Canada were not doing enough to prevent illegal immigration to the States and to stop the importation of fentanyl into the US. On both scores, both leaders of both countries, Mrs. Sheinbaum and Mr. Trudeau, have both immediately taken action to try to appease the US. First of all, there is practically no fentanyl that passes from Canada to the US. In fact, fentanyl is probably much more trafficked from the US into Canada. On the immigration part from Canada to the US, Canada said that they are spending $1 billion on new drones, new border patrols, and trying to stop people crossing from Canada into the US, and they've already stopped some people trying to do that. So in other words, the amount of goodwill that Canada has shown in this issue is really the most that could possibly be affected. Similarly, Mexico sent 10,000 troops, Mexican troops, to the border to act as a kind of a screen or shield against illegal immigration into the US. And they also have arrested drug cartel, bosses who were involved in the fentanyl manufacture and shipment industries. So on both the northern and southern borders, the two partners in the US-Canada trade agreement have said and acted to try to appease the reasons why Mr. Trump was threatening to put tariffs on. And he knew that this was going to happen. But his reasoning wasn't the immigration and the drug issues were excuses for Trump to put tariffs on, because he just wanted to put tariffs on anyway, since he is a believer in what's called mercantilism, meaning that each country should be self-sufficient and that they should not depend on other countries for trade. Or to refine it a little more, countries should be exporters only and not importers. Obviously, not every country can be doing that, because if every country exports and nobody imports, obviously there can't be any exports if no one's going to be doing the importing. The idea of mercantilism is something which really got its start in the imperial era, the era when France and Spain and Great Britain owned colonies all around the world. And their idea was that the colony should supply the raw material, the goods would be manufactured in the home country and sold to the rest of the world. So that if you look at the sort of whole empire, there would be no need to import goods from the rest of the world if you have your own sources of supply. And that was the philosophy of the great powers of the time, so in such a way so that when it comes to, say, the Americas, Great Britain did not allow the colonies themselves to trade with each other. In other words, they didn't want, let's say, Spanish possessions or Dutch possessions to be trading with British possessions, because they wanted to control the trade only from the home country. And even you might have two islands right next to each other. They didn't want any trade passing between the islands, because that would kind of break the monopoly of the home country. This whole system collapsed when the empires collapsed, and even remnants of it were broken when the European Common Market was established, the EU was established. So that, for example, just to give you an example, France was importing very, very expensive bananas from Guadeloupe and Martinique, when they could have been buying bananas from Colombia and Costa Rica, and at half the price. So when the EU was formed, these sort of antiquated trade policies were abandoned, and Great Britain, did the same thing when the Commonwealth ties were loosened. So a period of free trade really came into effect, especially after 1960, up until these times. And that resulted in a certain sense of prices being the lowest possible for the consumer, and the countries producing what they could produce best. So you had a kind of a concentration of excellence in that the countries which did the best job at producing something were able to sell it. And there were no artificial barriers put in place to stop those things. Barriers gradually came into effect when, especially when China began its huge growth and started to undermine the world businesses and world economies with exporting goods cheaper than anyone else could make them. And they succeeded for quite a long time in doing that until finally some countries realized that if their whole industries would be decimated if China were allowed to produce goods and sell them at the cheapest prices all around the world. So they gradually began putting tariffs on, but not to the extent that it would stop world trade. Mr. Trump has a belief that if America puts tariffs on goods coming from abroad, these goods will then be made in the United States. But of course, this is a fallacy because it takes so much time and effort and investment to create an industry that will replace foreign cheap imports that it's just not a practicable solution. And of course, Mr. Trump's tariff war on other countries, he neglects to take into consideration or to publicize the fact that other countries will just reply and put tariffs on American goods, thus costing American jobs and not adding to American jobs. And that's exactly what's happened. So Canada, the US, and Mexico supply 40%, those three countries supply 40% of all goods imported into the US. Cars, parts, electronics, computers, everything, especially those are the things that come from Canada and Mexico. China, of course, exports everything to the United States, from clothes to furniture to just about anything that you can buy in a dollar store. All those things are made in China. The stock market, which is such a good gauge of consumer business and sentiment, dropped so heavily on Monday and today that they gave their judgment right away as to the wisdom of the effects of tariffs on the American economy. So the stock market is now down 10% from the high that it reached just last month, and it's continuing to drop. Car companies especially were being affected because car parts and car assembly is being done in Canada, the US, and Mexico, and the same car could be shifted back and forth a few times before it finally comes out on the finish line. China issued counter tariffs. So the United States issued a 10% tariff on China and then doubled that to another 10% just today. And China responded with tariffs on things that America sends to China, especially agricultural products. So goods like wheat, chicken, corn, cotton, pork, soybeans, beef, fruit, vegetables, and dairy, all those agricultural products were being imported from the US to China. And all these things are easily replaced by importing the same goods from other countries, even countries in the Americas, like Brazil and Argentina, can easily replace the United States for all those type of things, and Australia as well, and New Zealand. So it's American farmers that will feel it the hardest, and that's the heartland of the US, and it's also the Republicans supporting places that will be affected the most. And Canada similarly issued tariffs today of 25% on US imports of $30 billion worth of imports. And Canada's, again, trying to target Republican states, who are the supporters of Trump by putting tariffs on things like American whiskey, American bourbon, made in Tennessee and Kentucky, on peanut butter, on orange juice from Florida. things that that will affect the economies of the states supporting Trump more than anything else. The lumber industry is also one which is being targeted strongly by the US. And here things are touch complicated because the United States wants to stop lumber imports from Canada in order to encourage lumber mills in the US to produce more lumber. And of course, what he's done is saying that they could cut lumber anywhere on US lands, on federal lands. The problem being that there aren't enough mills to produce that lumber. There aren't the workers to cut the trees down. There aren't the trucks to transport the stuff. And China also put a tariff on US lumber exports. So in other words, the US was exporting lumber to China at the same time as they were importing lumber from Canada. So the logic is, therefore, that the lumber that used to go to China will stay in the States, and the US will now stop buying lumber from Canada. So this is definitely a complication. And I have to say, for Quebec in particular, it's bad news, and for British Columbia as well, because we're the ones who produce most of the lumber going into the US. So I'm sure that the lumber mills in Quebec, and I've seen them myself, I've seen truck after truck leaving northern Quebec and driving down to the US border. And, this business will be affected so much. And in many of those northern Quebec towns, lumber is just about the only thing that they do there. It's the only source of industry in the whole cities, places, like Chibougamau and other places like that. So this is going to be really kind of earth shaking, we'll call it. And in the Ontario, the car parks in the car industry employs 500,000 people, one way or another. So, I mean, this is really a huge threat to the Ontario economy. And both Prime Minister Trudeau and Ford of Ontario have given eloquent speeches, which I've seen on CNN, telling Americans that Canadians love Americans, but they just cannot take what the president is doing. And I think those were both really good presentations that they gave on them. The reaction of the world, and especially Canada and Mexico, to these tariffs are that they have to try to look for new markets. And in the case of Mexico, 80% of Mexican exports go to the US, and 77% of Canadian exports go to the US. So it's pretty hard on the first round to look for alternative markets when so much, when there's such dependence on one customer. Canada is looking to Europe to see what they could sell there. Canada would try to sell more to China, but China has had its own quarrels with Canada, and at one point or other stopped Canadian exports into China. People are saying that Canada might try to apply to join the EU. And it's an interesting idea. Of course, it would take the word European out of the European Union. And it takes a long time to apply for membership. And a lot of European countries would object to Canada joining because Canada isn't in Europe, and because there's other European countries waiting in line to join. But still, since Canada is known as a producer of natural resources and Europe is a consumer of natural resources, this might be a half decent fit for Europe. One of the, I would say, we could look at this also in terms of the US, is that one of the casualties that Canada will experience in order to have these tariffs removed or to join Europe would be the supply management system that Canada has in agriculture, meaning we know that the chickens, eggs, poultry, turkey, dairy products, these are protected at very high prices by the supply management system. The US has demanded that this system be abolished. And if Canada ever tried to join the European Union, for sure, this is also something that would have to be abolished. So I think maybe the writing is on the wall for this supply management system, which really hurts Canadian consumers more than anything else, and benefits a shrinking number of farmers who are the big producers of these goods. I'd like to point out that Australia and New Zealand both had supply management systems. They both canceled them, and the farmers are by and large not worse off than they were beforehand. So that's just a point about that. It's also encouraged Canada to look at interprovincial trade and to drop the barriers that exist between provinces. And these barriers have to do with trying to support local wine and alcohol industries, to try to support local trucking industries. And some people say it's easier to trade with the U.S. than for provinces to trade with each other. And if that's the case, these barriers are going to be dropped pretty quickly, I think. I think the response of China is much more serious to these tariffs than the response of Mexico, which we don't know yet, or Canada, because China has just about a monopoly on producing materials like rare earths and refining products that are not rare earths, but refining products that are practically 100% done in China, like lithium and tungsten. And these rare earths and these products have multiple uses. But for example, just to give you an idea, to make a charger for a smartphone, you need certain materials that are only available in China. And if China cuts off and which they have already done, if they cut off the supply of these materials, it will be really hard to replace them because they have such unique properties and such unique uses. Of course, when it comes to economics, nothing is foolproof or sealed. In other words, China might say we're not going to sell any rare earth materials to the US, but they could sell them to other places that will, these things will end up in the US, just the way the boycott of Russia or boycott of Iran has not been nearly as foolproof as the US thought, because Russia and Iran can always buy US goods shipped to other countries. So this economic war, and it is a war, it's a trade war, never has a winner. History has shown us that the trade wars in the past, and the United States notably tried this in the 1930s when the Depression began, the United States' first response was to stimulate industry in the US by keeping out foreign goods. And that trade war that started only increased the effects of the Depression and didn't help industry in the United States. And the Depression lasted 10 years until the Second World War broke out, whereas it could have ended much sooner had all of these trade wars or the tariffs not been applied. So, Trump has this idea that he wants a trade war. He wants to be tough, but the results will be higher prices for consumers at a time when consumers were, in a certain sense, defeated the Biden administration because of high prices. And Trump said he will lower prices on day one, but of course, prices will only go up because of tariffs. So, a tariff is a tax. A tariff is paid by the importing country. And the tariff that is paid for has to be reflected either in increased prices or lower profits for the companies doing the importing. And pretty well every consumer in the US will be affected by the tariffs that they put on the three countries. And that's why the stock market understands this, and that's why the stock market has dropped instantly so much. The last time, in the last administration, Trump put tariffs similarly, smaller tariffs on imports, and he was forced to take them off after a year. So we'll see what happens this time, but it certainly is not good news, especially not for Canada, because we're the smallest country of the between the three countries, and we are, you know, very dependent on trade with the United States. And also, the United States said that they would put tariffs on other countries, worldwide countries as well. So the whole world will be involved in some sort of a tariff war. So what has been the results of this declaration of war, we'll call it, against Canada? I have some figures here. To repeat to you or to tell you about. First of all, 86% of Canadians in a poll have a negative opinion of Trump. What that means is 14% have a positive opinion. Now, who possibly in Canada could have a positive opinion on Trump? Who are those 14%? And I would guess that some of them might be Orthodox Jews who just love Trump's idea of a Riviera in the Gaza. 66% of Canadians are buying fewer US-made goods. 51% of Canadians say they're going to avoid McDonald's, Starbucks, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Burger King, and Subway. 45% say they're buying less from Costco, Walmart, and Winners. 30% who said they were planning a trip to the US have canceled the trip. And I can tell you from here, my house in Florida, that there are many, many Canadians have decided to sell their properties here. Obviously, the drop in the Canadian dollar has a lot to do with it, but some of them just say, you know, I can go somewhere else. I don't have to go to the US for my winter holiday. I can go to other countries. So this has a kind of, I would call it, a silent effect on the US, and especially spending by Canadian tourists in the US going down will have a very large effect in the long run on specific places. 1/3 of the US says they support tariffs on Canada. 50% say they support tariffs on China. So, you know, Trump has convinced 30 or 40% of Americans that what he's doing is good, but, you know, they haven't yet seen what the results are of his tariff war. And certainly at this point, Republicans are afraid to speak out against Trump because they're so afraid of him. But as this wears on, and as people start complaining, and as prices go up, there'll be more and more complaints against Trump because of what he's done. So let's leave this subject for now, and let's get on to the most important subject, which is the debacle that occurred when Zelensky came to the United States, and where Trump completely insulted him and told him that he shouldn't be the president of Ukraine, called him a dictator, said that he's losing the war against Russia and has no choice but to agree to Trump's terms to end the war. And Trump's terms to end the war left no punishment for the aggressor, which is Russia, and said that Russia could keep or should keep all the territory that it already captured from the Ukraine. So this is a kind of a rewarding you know, you could imagine that in the Second World War, if America came to Japan and said, well, okay, we want to end the war, and you could keep the Philippines, and you could keep Indonesia, and Hitler could keep all of Germany, but we just want to cease fire. I mean, that's in a certain sense what Trump is saying to the Ukraine and to the world. And the worst of it is that he says that the Ukraine started the war. And there's no possible explanation for this because it was Russia that invaded the Ukraine both in 2014 and in 2022. And the Ukraine has had individual civilians massacred in Bucha, the town north of Kiev. There were mass murders of civilians. There's mass bombings of apartments, hospitals, and schools. And in no way is Ukraine responsible for any of this. So for Trump to invent something that sounds like it comes out of Putin, it shows how the United States has made this 180-degree turn on this long-standing conflict, now 3 years going. Even Republicans are shocked by this kind of U-turn. And some of them are willing to speak openly and some of them are not. But in no way is Russia the friend of the US. In no way can Russia help the US. So this is just purely Trump going off on his own for no kind of reason, except to say that he doesn't believe in foreign aid. He doesn't believe in spending money abroad. And so helping the Ukraine, according to Trump, is something that is costing the US money. As I pointed out last week, the money that's being sent to the Ukraine in the shape of weapons, those weapons are all made in the US. So somebody is getting wages and somebody is providing the services. And it's really an economic gain for the arms industry. And it's not a loss for the United States to be shipping these weapons off to the Ukraine. Let me just say, well, yeah, okay. I just want to mention that to go back to the tariffs business, that the response in Canada has been such a huge sort of national unity movement that Canada has been united by this move so much more than it's ever been. There was a poll taken showing that 90% of Canadians don't want to join the US. Remember, Trump wants to take over Canada. And you wonder who the 10% are who said that they would want to join the US. And I'm wondering, and it's just a wondering, whether some of those aren't English Quebecers who think that finally that they would be treated as equal citizens in this new setup. But I wonder who those 10% are. Some of them are just pure, call them very right-wing conservatives who feel uncomfortable in Canada for cultural reasons, and they want to go to the U.S. Policies of being, ultra-conservative on social issues, abortion, birth control, the death penalty, guns, and all that other stuff. So I think that he needs, Canada could give Trump a reward for uniting Canadians. Let's go back to the other great embarrassment, which was a vote at the United Nations where there was a motion to support the Ukraine. And the United States voted against it, along with Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Nicaragua, Russia, Belarus. I mean, this is the company that the United States was keeping in that vote. Shockingly and embarrassingly and horribly, Israel voted against the Ukraine in that vote as well, at the insistence of the United States. Now, this is just such a terrible embarrassment for Israel to be on the side of Iran, North Korea, Russia, and all those other bums that I mentioned, there were 65 abstentions. And Israel could well have just said, okay, we're abstaining. But at Trump's insistence, Israel voted against this motion. Remember, it was, of course, Russia that attacked Israel. And if you think that, if you think back at the times when Israel was being attacked by the Arab world in the 1948 war, in the 56 war, in 1967, how would Israel have felt, if Israel was being condemned for a war which they weren't starting? It's an embarrassment, I think, to Israel, and it shows how craven Netanyahu is to, I would say, to kiss the feet of Trump on an issue which has got such a white and black, a white and black situation of the good guys and bad guys. I think that this is another. If Netanyahu needs more nails in his coffin, I think this would be another one. But what does this vote say to Europe? What does this vote say to NATO? What does this vote say to an alliance which was established after the Second World War, which said that all members of NATO have to defend each other if they are under attack? And here the United States is voting with the chief attacker, the attacker who has attacked. We know that he's attacked Ukraine now, Putin, but he's also attacked Georgia in the past. He has made all kinds of threats to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which are former republics in the Soviet Union, which are all members of NATO, but which are tiny, pretty well defenseless countries. And, surely are next on his list, along with Moldova, which is another former Soviet republic, which is led by a pro-European president. And if the United States sides with the enemies of these NATO partners, how likely is it that the United States would actually follow or complete their obligations if Russia actually goes and attacks these places? The whole European Union has, in practically 1 week, decided that they have to move away from the United States, not depend on the United States, has to strengthen its own forces and look for alliances outside the U.S. And the shock to Europe is just as big, as the shock to Canada was with the tariffs. So, Trump has accomplished a lot in this week. The public opinion in the U.S. is pretty well mirrors what the election showed, except that about 10% of the people who voted for Trump oppose all the things that he's doing. So he has somehow support of fewer than half of the voters, but he only got half of the votes in the election. So some of his support has slipped, not really a lot considering all of the acts that he's been doing. But I do believe that as time passes on, that he will lose public opinion and public support because of the effects of the things that he's done. Now, what else can I just say here? Let me just check my time. Okay. Other events, I mean, these are much smaller ones, but equally crazy. Trump says he wants to establish crypto as a reserve in the United States financial system. So you know that every country has reserves to use in case of a rainy day, to use in case of an emergency, to support the value of the currency that is being used in that country. And every country, the reserves consist of several different things. Sometimes, in some cases, it's gold. In some cases, it's US dollars. In some cases, it might be euros or British pounds. it might be bank accounts and deposits held in Switzerland. There's lots of different ways for a country to sort of to put money away for a rainy day. And Norway is one of the countries best at it. Their reserves are in the billions and billions of dollars for such a small country. But the United States all of a sudden says, oh, I want to use crypto as part of our reserves. Now, pretty well, most people understand that somehow the crypto is a bit of an unregulated and uncontrollable substance. And so many people have been burnt by scams and by false accounting in crypto. Lo and behold, that Trump himself has established a cryptocurrency of his own. And needless to say, I predict that this currency will be part of the US Reserve if it ever gets off the ground. But it's just another sort of loony idea that Trump has had, but which has huge consequences. Because if the United States counts the value of these so-called crypto reserves as its total reserve, when these things crash, and so far so many of them have, the sort of security that the United States provides to the world, the value of the American dollar will also be severely, challenged if any of these crypto things fail, which so many of them have. And it's amazing to me that people can bid up the value of a Bitcoin, which is the first and the biggest crypto exchange reserve, not reserve, but currency. And, all of it is built on basically nothing, because there's nothing backing the value of these things except for the demand that people have for it. So just another kind of a strange thing. He also said he wants to visit Fort Knox, Trump said, to make sure that all the gold that's in the U.S. Reserve is still in Fort Knox, because some of his people on the internet, have said, well, it's all fake and there's nothing there. So he wants to go check, and I say, let him go check. Why not? There is increasing because the demand for crypto and the creation of new coins or new cryptocurrencies is growing and growing. The amount of electricity that's needed to provide these things is growing and growing as well. And what's happening is that, especially in the third world, countries are sort of producing electricity to support the crypto industry, rather than providing electricity to citizens who still don't have any of it. And it's also causing changes to the natural environment, because dams are being made to provide electricity to the crypto industry, and other sources of electricity are being used for that. So it's starting to have its effect on the lives of people who are not even in the crypto world. And criminals, of course, are, needless to say, profiting from all this, because crypto is currency that could be exchanged, traded, and transferred without anybody looking at it or tracking it. Proceeds from crime, from gambling scams, from drugs, from other sorts of illegal activity can be translated into crypto money and then eventually cleaned off into regular money. So it's just another way to help the underworld, none of which is taxed, none of which benefits the countries that are being affected by this. A last little mention, and I think it's worth mentioning a little bit here, is if for people who are watching the Academy Awards, that an Israeli film won an Academy Award, and the government has issued a sentence saying that it's a sad moment for cinema that Israel won this award. It's very, in a certain sense, contradictory, but it was a documentary and a documentary, of course, is a kind of is a film made based on real events. It's not an invention. It's not something that's written. It's not a fiction. But this documentary was documenting the destruction by settlers in the West Bank of Palestinian villages and the attempted annexation of their lands. And the sort of ongoing harassment of Palestinian civilians is being carried out kind of not even in secret anymore. But these film crews were there to document it, and which, you know, in a certain sense, shines a light on something that the government was, you know, trying to kind of push under the rug and ignore in the whole sort of Gaza, the whole Gaza, you know, prisoner exchange and the not prisoner exchange, but I mean the Gaza, you know, negotiations to get the hostages back and to establish some sort of a future for Gaza. That you know, under the kind of the noses of these events, settlers have continuously tried to uproot Palestinians in the West Bank, and this film documented it. And you know, that's why the Israeli government, which is supported by the settlers, was so upset that this film won an Academy Award. And Mr. Brody, he got the Academy Award for Best Actor in that film, The Brutalist, which is definitely worth seeing, and one in which Mr. Brody, Adrian Brody, speaks Hungarian because his mom was Hungarian, and you know, it's a kind of another award for a Jewish actor who definitely has some tremendous talents. So I think that, let me see if I've got any other points that I wanted to bring up over here. I think that's about all. Yeah. Yeah, I think that that is some of the main things that I wanted to speak about. Maybe you know what? Maybe what we'll do is see. Certainly, because there's just so much kind of anxiousness and so much nervousness about where Canada is going, where our economy will be going with the 25% tariffs put on. The amount of job losses that are being predicted is so huge that you know, it's sort of focused the attention of all the provincial leaders who finally have come together, and the federal government, and in a certain sense has benefited the Liberal Party, whose numbers have started to go up in polls against the Conservatives, because they're the ones who spoke out so strongly against the US. And in a certain way, Mr. Poilievre is kind of caught a little bit behind, because he was, in a certain sense, boasting of his good relations with Trump, and that Canada would benefit from him being prime minister. And all of a sudden, that argument is kind of turned on its head. So that's why the polls have shown that the Liberals have done some gaining. It's a bit hard to focus what those polls are, because some of them are really quite different from other ones. But you know, if it's possible that Carney gets to be the leader of the party, and somehow or other he focuses his election campaign against Trump rather than against Poilievre, and if he manages to win the election, it would be an out-and-out miracle. I wanted also to point out that Chrystia Friedland, she was on Bill Maher this week and did a phenomenal presentation, you know, pretty well logically spelling out Canada's case against tariffs. And all of the Canadian leaders have spoken out so well in that way, including Mr. Legault, and including Doug Ford, the Prime Minister himself, and Poilievre, and Carney, and Freeland. So it's really united the country like nothing else has done before. So I wanted to hear if you've got any comments or questions about this. How do you think this would affect our own personal lives? Has anybody decided that they don't want to travel to the US? Has anyone said, oh, I'm going to look on the back of packages to see where these things are made? Just to give you an idea, for example, breakfast cereals like Cheerios, cornflakes, and all those other breakfast cereals. Many of them are made in Canada, but many of them are not. Many of them are just imported straight from the US. And if you look carefully on the back of the box, you will see, where they're made. And the irony is that sometimes they're actually made with grain coming from Canada, going to the US, for example, to Minnesota, where General Mills is located. So the grain is imported from Canada, the oats, let's say, made into Cheerios, and then those Cheerios are sent back to Canada in a box. So, it just goes to show how complicated things are when it comes to trade and the interdependence of Canada and Mexico and the US is so huge that to try to make a break in it is just a very difficult job. So yeah, see, have any of you taken any practical steps to try avoiding the US or avoiding things made in the US? Certainly, we hear of it here when interviews are being done on local television of Canadians who are in Florida. The message is really that Canadians are just so shocked and disgusted by these tariffs that they're willing to take practical steps to, in a certain way, punish the US. So, Angela, see what's doing out there in the world of the internet and Zoom, and let's hear if people have any comments or questions about any of the things that I've mentioned so far.
I don't see anything yet, but I have a question for you.
Sure.
What do you think is the end game of the American administration with everything they're doing, with the tariffs, with getting involved in the politics in Europe and talking about democracy? What do you think is their end game?
Well, let's just talk about the tariffs first, okay? Trump sees this as a kind of a way. Remember that what happens to the money that's being paid by the importers of goods coming from China, Mexico, Canada, Europe, or anything else? That money, that tariff money, goes right into the US Treasury. So it goes into, in other words, like the United States savings account, call it like that. What Trump wants to do with this money is to give tax breaks or tax reductions to the people to say, okay, you don't have to pay taxes because we're making the money on tariffs. That's kind of what is his, we'll call it his end game or his philosophy. In fact, what he's even talked about abolishing the Internal Revenue Service and replacing it with what he calls the External Revenue Service, meaning money coming from abroad going into the US Treasury. Now, needless to say that if people's livelihoods are affected, people lose their jobs because of the tariffs, because either the US won't sell as many goods to Canada, Mexico, and China because those countries are putting tariffs on the US as well. And all of these jobs that are lost won't be paying taxes to the US. It isn't shown that this is a money maker for the United States. Overall, this is going to be a money loser for the United States. But he wants to show that there's money in the bank in the US, so that, like I said, not only can he reduce taxes, but he also wants to show that the US is less in debt than it is now. The US, is running a deficit of trillions of dollars, meaning they spend way more than they collect. So by collecting all this tariff money, it reduces the amount of deficit that the U.S. has every year, and therefore he can say that he's lowering the deficit, the obligation that the U.S. has in balancing its budget. So I think those are his kind of thinking when it comes to tariffs and what happens to the money. Like I said, the long run is that it makes the U.S. poorer, not richer, but he's not looking at the long run. Now, as far as the shift going away from the European Union and the alliance, the United States feels that it gives much more than it gets. So even within NATO, the United States has been selling the idea that the United States is protecting the whole world. The United States is spending money on all of its military that is protecting the whole world. And in return, it's not getting anything back. It's not getting appreciation from the rest of the world. It's not getting the rest of the world is spending money to defend the United States. And in Trump's view, this is a waste. So why should the United States defend the rest of Europe when it's costing the taxpayer money? So therefore, by kind of getting out of its obligations to NATO, in a certain sense, he says, well, we're going to save money on all the all the defense expenditures that we have in the world. And the United States has an enormous defense budget. The defense is really the biggest budget item that the U.S. has besides Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And so far, the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk, has not touched the defense budget to try to say, well, where is the waste in the U.S. military? What is the military doing that they shouldn't have to do? How come the U.S. has so many ships, planes, and other expensive equipment out there while it's not doing anything? And the military is such a popular institution in the U.S. that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have been daring to try to lower its budget or to squeeze it or to reduce it. And this isn't happening under Trump either. So the United States before has tried and succeeded to get the other European Union members to spend more on their own defense. But specifically what the United States wants is that spending should go to the United States. In other words, they should buy American planes, American munitions, American warships, American technology. That would be a boost to the American economy. So other countries have stepped up, and especially since the invasion of the Ukraine, countries which were supposed to make a 2% of its GDP on defense, many countries like Poland have gone up to 4% of their GDP because they're just so afraid of the Russian, bear that they're willing to beef up their military to confront it. It's really hard to see what the U.S. gains by abandoning its obligations to NATO. The U.S. isn't reducing its military expenditures. It's just, I think, a fantasy of Trump that he loves what we would call dictators and so-called strongmen, and he's much more impressed by Putin than he is by Zelensky. Putin being a dictator, Zelensky was elected in an election. Trump said he's a dictator because there hasn't been an election in Ukraine, because there hasn't been one because of the war that Putin, did and caused. I do believe, well, let me just say something like this, that every president starts off with a whole baggage of goodwill that people say, okay, let's see what he can do. He was elected. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. I think that the shine will come off Trump a lot faster than it comes off other people, simply because the steps that he's taken are so irrational and harmful to the US that I think people will start realizing it pretty quick. We also have to remember that in less than 2 years, there are elections to the House of Representatives in the United States, specifically November 2026. And November 2026 is, on the horizon. We're already March 2025. So it's almost a year and a half away, and that there will be elections. And my prediction, and many other people are predicting, that the Democrats will win those elections, and that will make a significant but not an absolute break to the power of the president. He can cause a lot more damage in the meantime, especially if his Republican supporters and the Republican people in the Congress, who many of whom know better, go along with what he's been doing. Okay, so that was a good question, Angela. I don't know if I've answered it completely, but you tell me and see if there's anything else doing out there.
Yes, thank you for your answer. I do have a question here. I see that it says from an anonymous attendee. Do you think that Trump and his people considered how the tariffs would affect Boeing, which sells planes at 100 million or more each to Canada, when Air Canada and WestJet can buy Airbus planes from Europe?
Such a good question. It's really a great question. Um, let's answer this by starting off to say the following: that Airbus and Boeing are pretty well the only two major airline manufacturers in the world producing large commercial aircraft. China, I will have to tell you, is moving in that direction very, very quickly. So just put that in parentheses. Now, it is true that the world's airlines can choose between those two manufacturers. It's also true that each of those manufacturers has a big backlog of planes already. In other words, the increase in air travel has happened so quickly, and the need to modernize their fleets and to buy planes that have better gas mileage, and in many cases, starting to buy planes that don't even use jet fuel as fuel, that both these places have a real big back order of planes. So even if Air Canada or other airlines decide to change to Airbus, Boeing still has enough on its plate probably to last about 2 years worth of assembly. But there's another very important point, and it's not easy for an airline to shift its fleet from one plane to another because of the necessity to retrain pilots would be one thing. The necessity to change the whole maintenance, facilities to get parts from the other planes when they're only using one manufacturer's planes. If I'm not mistaken, Air Canada in particular uses both Boeing and Airbus planes, but there are a lot of airlines that are only using one of them, and it's easier said than done to change over, because Airbus itself also has a big wait list for planes. It also has a big back order for planes. So it's not something that could be happening that quickly. But you know what's easy to do? It's easy to say, oh, we are going to now change our priorities to order Airbuses, even though it actually doesn't happen. So it's easy to say something just to kind of, provoke the US and to, try to explain that there's a cost for the US for putting these tariffs on. And needless to say, let's say, for example, that Air Canada says, oh, we're going to put a tariff on American planes. Well, obviously, that would then shift the ground toward favoring buying planes from Airbus. And like I said, I want to repeat that China has now produced an equivalent models of planes for international travel. And the Chinese airlines themselves, who've been buying Boeing and Airbus planes, are now being encouraged to buy Chinese-made planes. And these planes have so far shown to be just as good as the other ones. So it won't be long before China enters the international passenger airline plane business. And when they finally do enter it, and their planes are certified by everyone, this will be a kind of an upheaval to the whole world aircraft purchasing business. So be on the lookout for that. It's on the horizon. We'll put it like that. So I hope that answers that question.
I don't see anything yet for another question.
Well, let me ask. I'm going to ask you again. Ask you all again. I mean, have you decided on a personal level to avoid buying American products where possible, to avoid traveling to the U.S. where possible? Because many Canadians have made that commitment, and I was reading that some manufacturers want to change their packaging to put "Made in Canada" in big letters so people would notice it. Have any of you thought about those things?
A lot of grocery stores have put made in Quebec and made in Canada, like little stickers underneath the product when it's not on the product itself.
Yes, that is true. I mean, I know for sure Quebec has done a kind of a campaign to try to encourage people to buy Quebec products, especially in the fruits and vegetable department. But remember, no surprise to anybody, we don't have a 12-month growing season here. Although I have to say this, by the way, and many people don't know this, but there is an enormous greenhouse vegetable growing industry, both in Quebec and in Ontario. And I am buying or looking at products here right in the Florida supermarkets, for example, cherry tomatoes or cucumbers. And it says on the label, Leamington, Ontario, Kingsville, Ontario. And some of these things are actually grown in Ontario, but other of these things are being imported by these Canadian companies from Mexico, and it will say product of Mexico imported by a company in Ontario. So, like I'm saying, that the trade between the three countries is so interconnected that you get these type of situations, very well. Canada imports a lot of produce from Mexico. And I'm wondering if the tariffs on Mexican products, let's say, for example, berries, let's say, for example, blueberries and blackberries and raspberries, all these things are at this season are grown in Mexico and shipped to the US and Canada. But if the US puts tariffs on those things and Canada doesn't, will the shipments be able to kind of pass through the US to come to Canada if the US isn't buying as much of it because the prices are so high? So even though, in other words, we don't have tariffs on Mexican produce, it may be that the American tariffs will be high enough to discourage customers in the US from buying them, and therefore it won't pay for Mexico to ship those goods to Canada because they don't have enough customers in the US for those things. You see how complicated things can get, when it comes to tariffs. It's really, it's a kind of an earth-shaking revolution, we'll say.
I think I had heard something about somewhere in Quebec, them trying to build a big, big greenhouse so we could grow things that we import from other countries, like avocados and stuff like that. I think I had heard that they were trying to make like a big, big greenhouse so we could grow our own
things. Well, let me say Quebec has an enormous, enormous greenhouse industry, enormous. But the greenhouses are good for growing vegetables, things like lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, where the turnover is the growing. In other words, the growing time is not so much that you can grow 2, 3, 4 crops a year under good conditions. Of course, artificial lighting, proper fertilizer, nutrition, water, and the electricity needed to heat the greenhouses is cheap in Quebec, and that's where we have the big advantage, we'll say, or the big input. But when it comes to things that are grown on trees, like avocados or oranges or bananas, that's where the cost of heating and the time it takes to grow these things is so long that it really doesn't pay. And it's doable. If you go to the botanical gardens in Montreal, you'll see banana trees, coffee trees, things like that. But it's doable, but it's not commercially doable. So I think, we certainly don't have to, import. We don't have to substitute imports for those things at such a high cost because we are importing those things and not from the US. But there are certain things that come from the US. So I'll give you an example, like watermelons. The US, even on the market today, if you go to stores in Canada, you'll find American melons because they are efficient at producing them. The transportation is there, and there isn't a Canadian alternative to those things except in season. And, like I said before, our season is not very long. Anybody else? No one has, postponed their trips to the US or actively looked to not buy American goods. I'm just curious about that.
So, Mr. Dwoskin, I have another question. I see
Yes.
an anonymous attendee says, what will be the effects on the rule of law when the U.S. ignores the trade agreements in place?
It is a really good question, and it's the not only does breaking the rules and regulations of the U.S. Mexico Canada trade agreement, being done unilaterally, but it does give the idea to the whole world that the U.S. can't be trusted. And this especially goes to, as what I was saying before, the mutual defense agreement between Canada, between the NATO partners. So it really does bring into effect the distrust of the United States, and this thing will have long-lasting effects long after Trump leaves office, because people will say, well, there could be another Trump, and who could ever trust the U.S.? Um, Unfortunately, as far as the United States, the NAFTA Accord, or the U.S., the USMCA Accord, the provisions of that agreement say that if one country puts tariffs on the other one, the only remedy that can be given is that the corresponding country is allowed to put equal tariffs on American goods. And Canada has already done this. So it doesn't, there isn't kind of, this agreement is, it sounds like a free trade agreement, but if a country breaks it, the punishments are not very big. And knowing the US, they will fight things out in courts, as Trump has done, forever and ever and ever. So these agreements are more based in a certain way on goodwill than on potential punishments for infringing them. And Canada has already taken its steps and will continue to put tariffs on the American goods. But we all know that this affects us here. This affects us here because if the tariffs are on American goods, it means the goods coming from the US will cost more. Now, we can always try to substitute those goods with imported goods, but certain things we can't. And, it just means that the cost of living of Canadians will go up. And at a time when, coping with inflation is not an easy thing to do, especially for people who are not as well off as other ones. So, in the US, this is going to cause damage to Trump's best supporters, who are the poor and uneducated people. Those are the people who voted for him, and they're the ones who are going to be affected the most by the rise in inflation because of tariffs that the US is putting on goods from its three biggest trading partners. So you should know, and I didn't mention this, but the US's biggest trading partners are Mexico, China, and Canada. And those three countries export more to the US than any other countries. So, it sure will be felt by anybody buying these goods and anybody making things that have these goods in them. So, for example, if the US puts tariffs on Canadian lumber, what that means is that house prices will go up. And I was looking at the stock market yesterday of house builders, American house builders, and their stocks went down immediately once these tariffs were being announced, because wood is a big component of houses in most parts of the US. And a lot of that wood comes from Canada. So it will spread itself out. It will have an effect on everybody, but it will raise the price of homes. That means that if people have to pay more for a home, they can buy less of other goods. And if they have to pay more for a car, and they're talking about car prices going up anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 to $10,000 a car, well, then they won't have money to buy on other things. So the whole economy will slow down because of it. So,
I don't see anything else, Mr. Dwoskin.
okay, you know what? We've had a good session, good questions, and I'm thankful again to everybody for tuning in and listening, and to you, Angela, for hosting. So we'll see you all next week.
Thank you, Mr. Dwoskin, and thank you to everyone listening in over the telephone and online. We shall see you next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Thank you.
Okay,
Have a
bye.
good day.
Bye bye.